For today's top stories, let's go over to the CBN News Desk.
Gordon, just days after the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage nationwide, Christian leaders are still dealing with what it means for religious liberty in America. And representatives from 11 religious groups gathered at the High Court to talk about its implications. Paul Strand has the story.
In one short week, the Supreme Court's decision changing the definition of marriage has sent shockwaves through America's religious communities.
We have seen from same-sex marriage decisions the repression of religious freedom of speech, and of freedoms of parents to guide the education of their own children.
LifeSite news editor John Henry Weston also pointed to what has happened to gay marriage opponents in other countries where it's already the law of the land.
In Ireland, when it passed, same-sex registrars were told they could be jailed for 6 months. Churches faced fines for denying same-sex ceremonies. In France, they forbid negative speech against homosexuality.
And some warn that the government could force Christians to go along with the new view of marriage.
Christian America is under siege by the forces of secularism. There is no doubt that the advocates of same-sex marriage will attempt to use the full force of the U.S. government to force Christians to secularize.
Weston advises Christian colleges, churches, and businesses to protect themselves from discrimination lawsuits by showing their resistance is not about homosexuality, it's about defending God's teaching on sexuality as a whole.
A principle of being against pornography and obviously sex before marriage and promiscuity and everything like that. And so those policies will at least, if they're upfront and known, will at least be showing, look, we are for the whole Christian teaching, the whole teaching of God's design for human sexuality, which we believe and practice, and therefore we're not being discriminatory at all.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
A Montana man says he was inspired by the Supreme Court's ruling legalizing same-sex marriage to apply for a marriage license so he can legally marry his second wife. And he says he plans to sue if the application is denied. He says you can't have marriage equality without polygamy. In the Middle East, Israel has closed its border crossings with Egypt after battles between Islamic terrorists and the Egyptian military. And Israel's prime minister is warning ISIS is knocking on the door of Israel's borders. George Thomas has more.
Smoke hung over Egypt's northern Sinai after the Islamic State's affiliate here killed at least 70 Egyptian soldiers. In an online post, the terror group called the operation a blessed raid and accused Egyptian forces of being an apostate army. The Egyptian army countered with multiple airstrikes, claiming to have killed more than 100 militants. But a former Israeli ambassador to Egypt says the Egyptian military response showed a huge intelligence failure and a lack of military expertise.
I think now we understand the Egyptian army is incapable of fighting strongly against guerrilla tactics. They need some help, some assistance, and it can come only from the United States. And as we know, Obama has refused to do it.
Islamic terrorists have killed hundreds of security forces since the Egyptian army toppled Islamist President Mohamed Morsi in 2013.
Egypt is the anchor, the basis of the Middle East, and if Obama's administration doesn't understand it, we are in trouble. Egypt is in trouble, Israel is also in trouble, and Europe is in trouble.
Meanwhile, Israel is watching the developments closely. It shares a border in the Sinai Peninsula, and it has closed its 2 border crossings with Egypt. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned his countrymen that terrorism is knocking at our borders.
We see ISIS at the gates, across the border in the Golan, across the border in Egypt.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Here at home, getting to the emergency room quickly can mean the difference between life and death. That's why people in rural areas are worried about their small-town hospitals closing. As Lori Johnson reports, they're not taking the news sitting down.
Portia Gibbs died while waiting to be airlifted to a big city hospital 80 miles away. Just 6 days earlier, her nearby rural hospital in Belhaven, North Carolina, closed.
A 48-year-old mother of 2 who spent the last hour of her life in the back of an ambulance in a high school parking lot.
Belhaven's mayor led this walk for rural hospitals from his small town to Washington, D.C. advocating the need for increased funding.
It's a 283-mile walk, 1 mile for every rural hospital that may be closed by the end of this year, leaving millions of folks who live in the country more vulnerable than ever before.
The small but determined band of walkers from 11 states battled weather, traffic, and insects to try to save rural hospitals on the chopping block.
You know, as a Christian, as someone that believes in a God that loves life and loves justice, then, you know, this is a fundamental core issue to faith and to all people's faith. Anybody that values life and wants to live in a world where people are treated with dignity.
There are a number of reasons more rural hospitals are losing money, such as increased operating costs and declining reimbursements.
Everybody in this country needs to be praying for these rural hospitals, because if these rural hospitals close, there's going to be an incredible death toll. If you take just 10 needless deaths per these 283 hospitals, that's equivalent to a 9/11 happening every year.
The closure of rural hospitals isn't just a health care crisis, it's also an economic one for small towns that are already feeling the pinch.
It's estimated the closures will force 36,000 people out of a job, translating into a loss of $10.6 billion in the gross domestic product.
The walk for rural hospitals, we shall not be moved.
After 2 weeks, the Walk for Rural Hospitals concluded with a rally on the steps of the U.S. Capitol.
Well, I think all of us need to reach out to our congressmen and our senators and let them know that rural hospitals closing, it's not a good idea. It needs to be stopped.
Supporters are working with lawmakers on a bill called Save Our Rural Hospitals. Lori Johnson, CBN News.